What really happens in an avoidance brain when you stop texting? Let's begin. Most people think that when you stop texting someone who's avoidant, they just move on. They think you're easy to forget, that you didn't matter. But let me tell you something that will change the way you see this forever. That silence, it's not peace for them, it's pressure. See, when you stop reaching out, their brain doesn't relax. It goes into overdrive. Because here's the truth. Avoidance is not a lack of care. It's a fear of connection. They've built walls, not because they don't want love, but because they're terrified what will happen if they let it in. They fear being seen, exposed, vulnerable. So when you were texting, calling, showing up, they felt like they were losing control. It wasn't your love they didn't want. It was the mirror you held up. But when you stop, the space you leave behind doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like a void. A storm of what ifs starts to rise. What if they're really gone? What if I pushed too hard? What if I messed up the only person who ever actually saw me? This is not about playing games. This is about reclaiming your power, about recognizing that your silence isn't revenge. It's a message that says, I will not beg to be chosen. I will not chase what runs from me. I am not here to fix what fears intimacy. And the avoidant brain, it starts doing what it always feared. It starts feeling. That's the beginning of their growth or their spiral. You want to change the dance? Stop feeding the pattern and watch what happens. Silence doesn't mean nothing's happening. Sometimes silence is when everything starts. People misunderstand avoidance all the time. He painted as cold, distant, uncaring, like they simply shut off their emotions and walk away without a second thought. But that's not the truth, not even close. You've got to understand, avoidants don't stop caring. In fact, many of them care too much. That's the problem. They care so deeply that it becomes overwhelming. It activates an old wound, a belief that if they get too close, something bad will happen, that they'll be trapped, controlled, or hurt all over again. This isn't about logic. This is about survival. Most avoidant patterns begin in childhood. When connection was inconsistent, smothering, or unsafe, the avoidant brain learned to survive by pulling away. Imagine being a child and reaching out for comfort, only to be rejected, criticized, or made to feel like a burden. The brain forms a strategy. If I don't need anyone, they can't hurt me. That thought, that protective mechanism becomes hardwired. So now as adults, every time someone gets too close, their system lights up with warnings. They're not pushing away because they don't care. They're pushing away because they're afraid of needing you and losing you, or worse, of you needing them and them not being enough. It's not rejection, it's defense. When you were texting them, checking in, showing up with love, they weren't numb. They were battling that inner war between craving intimacy and fearing it, between wanting to be seen and feeling like they'll fall apart if someone really does see them. And that fear doesn't show up as tears. It shows up as withdrawal, as disinterest, as I'm just not ready for something serious right now. But under that armor is a person who does feel, they just don't feel safe cleaning with you yet, or maybe with anyone. They're scanning for danger, not affection. That's the hardest part to understand. You could have been everything they ever wanted, kind, steady, warm, present, but none of that matters to the avoidant unless they've done the work to allow it in. Because to an avoidant, love doesn't feel like love. It feels like pressure. It feels like exposure. It feels like the very thing they've spent a lifetime running from, vulnerability. So the distance they create, it's not because they didn't care about your good morning texts, your check-ins, your efforts. It's because every one of those acts of love hit a nerve. Each message said, I'm here, I see you, I care. And while that might sound beautiful to someone secure, to an avoidant it feels like a trapdoor opening beneath their feet. Not because your love is wrong, but because their wiring is still telling them, I let them in, I lose control. If I get close, I get hurt. If I need them, they can leave me, so they shut down. But here's what they don't tell you. That shutdown doesn't mean their heart turned off. It just means they couldn't find a way to stay connected without feeling consumed. And many times, once you're gone, they start to feel again. That's when the thoughts creep in, the memories, the questions, the regret. But by then, they've pushed so far away, they don't know how to come back without shame or fear of being exposed again. Avoidants are not heartless. They're heart-armored. There's a big difference. They didn't walk away because they didn't care. They walked away because they didn't know how to let themselves care without it turning into panic. And that's the deep hit of loving someone avoidant, knowing that the very thing you offered was the thing they feared the most. You can't fix that for them, but you can understand it. You can stop taking their silence as proof you didn't matter. You did, maybe more than they ever let on. But until they deal with that fear, that survival response, that old story, that love equals danger, caring will always feel like a threat. They don't stop caring. They just hide from what caring could cost them. Something powerful happens the moment you stop texting someone who's avoidant. Most people think it's just a break in communication, some silence, a pause, but it's so much more than that. What you're really doing is breaking a deeply conditioned pattern that's been keeping both of you stuck. You're no longer dancing to the rhythm they unconsciously set. You step out of the loop, and in doing that, you shift the entire dynamic. You see, avoidants operate within a predictable emotional framework. Connection, withdrawal, confusion, repeat. When you reach out, they pull back. When you try to get closer, they need space. The more you give, the more they retreat. It's not because they don't appreciate it. It's because the more emotional energy they receive, the more overwhelmed they become. It's like trying to water a plant whose soil is already soaked. They don't absorb it, they drown in it. So in an attempt to survive that feeling of being flooded, they distance themselves, thinking that's the answer. But here's the truth. Every time you text, call, check in, you're unintentionally reinforcing the pattern. You're saying, I'll hold the emotional weight for both of us, and for someone who's avoidant, that's incredibly tempting because they get the comfort of knowing you're there without the responsibility of showing up emotionally themselves. It feels safe for them, but not for you, because you start living in a space of emotional scarcity, always waiting, always hoping, always wondering if you're too much or not enough. Now imagine what happens when that text doesn't come, when the pattern is disrupted, when the energy that used to flow toward them stops. At first, the avoidant feels relief, a sense of regained space, freedom. They may even think they're better off, but that's just the surface response. Underneath it, something begins to shift. The silence grows louder. Their sense of control starts to wobble because they've gotten used to you being the emotional stabilizer. And now, with you gone, they're left with themselves, with their own thoughts, their own feelings, the very things they've been running from. That silence you're giving, it becomes a mirror. It reflects back the parts of themselves they've avoided, the discomfort they thought they could outrun by staying detached. When you're no longer there to validate their worth, to soothe their nervous system with your presence, they're forced to sit in the void they've been trying to fill with distance. That's where the pattern begins to crumble. That's when the real work, the work can begin. Avoidants don't change through more comfort. They change through contrast. And your silence is the contrast they didn't know they needed. It's not cruel. It's catalytic. It forces them to ask the questions they've been too distracted to face. Why did they stop reaching out? Why do I miss something I thought I didn't? What? Why does this quiet feel heavier than all the noise? You're not punishing them. You're realigning yourself. You're no longer operating on the belief that love means overextending. You're no longer staying emotionally available to someone who only opens up in fragments. And in doing that, you're shifting the entire structure of the relationship dynamic. You're putting the responsibility for connection back where it belongs on both people. And here's what most people don't realize. When you stop texting, it doesn't just affect them. It transforms you. You start to reclaim your time, your peace, your energy. You begin to see that your worth is not tied to how often someone responds. You realize that love is not about convincing someone to care. It's about holding space for those who show up fully. Interrupting the pattern is hard. It takes strength to not reach out, to sit with your own discomfort, to resist the urge to fix, to explain, to chase. But in that pause lies your power. In that space, you create room for truth, whether that means reconnection from a place of mutual growth or the freedom to walk away with clarity. The moment you stop texting isn't just a breaking contact. It's a declaration, a statement to yourself and the universe that says, I am no longer dancing in circles that lead nowhere. I am no longer feeding a pattern that keeps me small. And whether they rise to meet you or not, you've already broken free. When you stop texting an avoidant, it doesn't just create space between you. It opens up a floodgate of internal chaos. It may seem like silence, but for the avoidant brain, that silence is like a storm on the horizon. You've stopped giving them the validation they've been used to receiving, and that sudden lack of external reassurance triggers something deep inside of them. It's not just about losing contact with you, it's about losing the validation they've depended on to feel secure. When the texts stop, so does the stream of emotional confirmation that they're loved, wanted, or cared for. And that absence leaves them grappling with something far more uncomfortable: uncertainty. You see, the avoidant brain is wired to feel anxious when there's no clear feedback. They're constantly scanning for emotional cues, for signs that they are accepted, that they're safe. This isn't a conscious effort. It's instinctual. When they're in a relationship with someone, even if they push away the feedback they get from that person through texts, calls, little check-ins, feeds their sense of safety. It's like a tether that keeps them grounded, even if they never truly let themselves lean in emotionally. But the moment that tether is cut off, the ground beneath them begins to shift. And here's where the self-doubt spirals in. Without your consistent messages, without your reach-outs, they are left alone with their thoughts. And for an avoidant, that is terrifying. Their fear of abandonment, of rejection, of being unimportant, all of those deep-rooted insecurities begin to surface. They might start questioning everything. Did I mess up? Was I too distant? Did they lose interest in me? Did I push them away too much? And while they may never admit it, that self-doubt can be overwhelming. For someone who is avoidant, their sense of worth isn't built on their own internal validation. It's built on external sources, on you, in many cases. So when you stop texting, it's not just a logistical gap, it's an emotional chasm that makes them question their own value. It's easy for them to tell themselves, I don't need anyone, or I don't care if they don't text me. But deep down, when they don't get that constant flow of emotional feedback, their mind starts racing. They begin to wonder if they're too much or if they're not enough. Too harsh, they question, closed off, whether or too distant. And when they can't get those answers from you, the spiral continues deeper and deeper until they feel entirely disconnected, not just from you, but from themselves. What happens in the avoidant brain when this validation disappears is far from simple. It's a battle between the old defense mechanisms, the emotional walls they've spent years building, and the rising tide of self-awareness that's difficult to ignore. They might feel the urge to reach out, to pull you back into the familiar pattern. But at the same time, they fear that reaching out will only prove how vulnerable they are. It's like being caught between a desire to be reassured and a fear of being rejected for needing that reassurance in the first place. Here's the painful irony. They won't reach out because they don't want to appear needy, but in their silence, they need validation more than ever. And without it, the inner conflict deepens. The longer they go without that external validation, the more self-doubt seeps in. They question their own ability to trust people, to trust their own judgments, and to trust that anyone could truly want them, flaws and all. And that spiral often leads to them withdrawing even further. This is why the absence of texts, of calls, of constant contact is so powerful. It's not about what you did or didn't do. It's about the fact that you stop providing them with what their brain interprets as safety. And that leads to a storm of uncertainty, self-doubt, and fear. And in that fear, they either learn to confront their insecurities or they continue to spiral, retreating deeper into their emotional shell. This pattern of withdrawal isn't a sign that they don't care. It's a sign that their brain doesn't know how to handle the complexity of their own feelings. And when it's faced with that complexity, the only thing they know how to do is shut down. They start to doubt not just a relationship, but their own capacity to handle it. The longer the silence continues, the deeper the spiral of self-doubt becomes. When you stop texting an avoidant, it's not about punishing them or playing some game of manipulation. It's not about making them feel bad or forcing them to chase after you. It's about something much more important: self-respect. The truth is, silence in this context is a form of reclaiming your power. It's about choosing not to stay in a dynamic that doesn't serve someone else anymore, reaches out and recognizing that your worth for so long you've been the one extending, the one giving, the one reaching across the emotional divide, whether it was with texts, calls, or gestures. You've been the one showing up, and that might have felt good at first. You were connecting, you were present, you were trying to make it work, but over time, something started to feel off. Maybe they withdrew, or they didn't match your effort, or they became distant, and you found yourself constantly questioning whether your efforts were enough. You kept extending yourself, hoping that the more you gave, the more you'd get back. But the truth is, you weren't just giving, you were overextending. You were compromising your own emotional well-being for the sake of someone else. That's where silence comes in. Silence isn't about revenge. It's not about saying, I'm done with you, or I'm going to teach you a lesson. It's not about getting back at them for being distant or emotionally unavailable. Silence is about recognizing your own value. It's about acknowledging that you deserve to be in a relationship where both parties are contributing equally, where both people are meeting each other in the middle, offering their time, their energy, and their presence. Silence is your way of saying, I will no longer chase. I will no longer beg to be chosen. When you stop texting, you stop feeding into the pattern that has kept you stuck. You stop trying to convince someone to care, to respond, to show up for you. And in doing that, you give yourself the freedom to stop waiting, to stop questioning, to stop wondering if you're too much. Or not enough. You take yourself out of the emotional labor that has kept you running in circles. You stop compromising your own emotional needs for someone who's not willing to meet you halfway. And when you do that, you're not just honoring yourself, you're demanding respect. You're saying that your emotional energy is precious, and you will not give it to someone who doesn't recognize its value. This doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop sacrificing your own peace for the hope of a response that may never come. It's about protecting your emotional space. It's about understanding that you don't need someone else's validation to feel worthy. You are enough on your own, and no amount of texting or chasing will change that. In fact, it often makes you lose sight based on their responses or attention and measure affection. Silence is your boundary. It's you saying, I will no longer be available to someone who isn't willing to be available to me. And in doing that, you create room for something better. You create space for relationships that are mutual, where the energy flows both ways, where you don't feel like you're always the one extending, always the one waiting, always the one giving. The moment you stop texting, you send a powerful message not to the avoidant person, but to yourself. You're telling yourself that your needs matter, that you are worthy of being seen, of being heard, of being valued. You're telling yourself that you will no longer tolerate emotional neglect, even if it means stepping away from something that once seemed important. And that in itself is an act of self-respect. So don't mistake your silence for spite. Don't mistake it for pettiness. It's not about revenge. It's about reclaiming your worth and your energy. It's about saying that you deserve someone who will meet you where you are, not someone who keeps you in the dark, waiting for scraps of attention. Silence is a message of strength. It's a message of self-love. It's a message of self-respect. And in the end, it's the most empowering choice you can make when faced with someone who isn't capable of meeting you halfway. First move to offer reassurance, to fill the silence with your emotional presence. They don't have to face their fears. They can continue retreating into their shells, avoiding the vulnerability that would allow them to grow, and postponing the work they need to do on themselves. But when you stop texting, when you create that silence, you disrupt the comfortable cycle they've built for themselves as you force them to confront their own emotions, their own patterns, and the discomfort they've been running from. This discomfort is what drives growth. The avoidant may feel an initial sense of relief when you stop reaching out, space, freedom, the ability to breathe without the pressure of connection. But over time, that relief turns into something else. It turns into doubt. It turns into the nagging feeling that something is missing. Missing peace. The opportunity for growth emerges. They are forced to sit with themselves and ask the hard questions. Why does the silence feel so heavy? Why does it hurt when they're not reaching out? What is it that I'm really afraid of? This is where the magic happens. When you create space For them to experience discomfort, you give them the opportunity to examine their own fears and beliefs. They have to face the things they've been avoiding, the fear of intimacy, the fear of getting hurt, the fear of being abandoned. And for an avoidant, this is no small thing. They've spent years learning how to shut those fears out, how to protect themselves by keeping others at arm's length, but with your silence, they can't run anymore. The discomfort forces them to take a hard look at their own walls, their own defenses, and the patterns that have kept them stuck for so long. This is not to say that discomfort always leads to a breakthrough immediately. It doesn't. The avoidant may resist, they may pull further away, or they may try to fill the void with distractions. But eventually the discomfort becomes so undeniable that it creates a crack in the armor they've built. And that crack is where growth begins. They begin to question their own strategies, their own defenses, and whether they've been pushing people away because they truly want to or because they've been too scared to let anyone in. The process of growth in an avoidant person isn't always pretty. It's messy, uncomfortable, and often filled with confusion and self-doubt. But it's necessary. Without that discomfort, there's no motivation to change. Without the space, there's no room for transformation. And in that discomfort, the avoidant may begin to learn the very thing they've been avoiding: how to be vulnerable, how to trust, how to let someone in without fearing that they'll be abandoned or hurt. But it's important to remember that growth, even though it's painful, is worth it. When we step into discomfort, we step into the unknown, and it's in the unknown where real change occurs. It's in that space of uncertainty that we begin to understand ourselves better, challenge our old beliefs, and redefine what's possible for us. For the avoidant, this discomfort could lead to breakthroughs in how they connect with others, how they handle intimacy, and how they approach relationships in the future. But that growth can only happen if they're allowed to feel the pain of what's missing and what they fear. It's the only way they can break free from the patterns that have held them back. So while silence may feel difficult for both you and the avoidant, it's actually one of the most powerful things you can offer them. You're giving them the chance to grow. You're giving them the space they need to face their discomfort and ultimately evolve. And in that process, both of you have the opportunity to move towards something better, a deeper, more authentic connection, whether it's with each other or with yourselves. When you stop texting and avoiding, something remarkable begins to happen. They are forced to confront themselves in ways they never expected. You may not realize it, but by breaking the communication pattern that has become so ingrained in your relationship, you give them the opportunity to truly evaluate their own behavior, their own fears, and their own role in the dynamic that has been playing out. For someone who is avoidant, relationships are often a series of unconscious patterns. They reach out, they pull away, they seek closeness, and then distance themselves, all in an effort to protect themselves from emotional vulnerability. But when you stop reaching out, you interrupt that cycle. And in that interruption, you create the space for them to look inward. The avoidant brain is wired for self-preservation. It thrives on creating emotional distance as a way to avoid the discomfort of vulnerability. They fear being overwhelmed, they fear being hurt, and they fear getting too close because they believe it will eventually lead to pain or rejection. This behavior is not a conscious choice. It's a protective mechanism they've learned over time. The problem, however, is that these patterns keep them stuck. They never get the opportunity to examine their behavior because they're constantly reacting from a place of fear. When you stop texting, when you pull back, it forces them to pause and take a hard look at the reality of the situation. The avoidance patterns they've been relying on so long are suddenly disrupted. They can no longer rationalize their behavior by convincing themselves that you're too much, too needy, or too demanding, with no one to react to. They are left alone with their thoughts, and in that silence, they have no choice but to reflect. They begin to ask themselves, why do I pull away when things get close? Why does someone's affection make me uncomfortable? What is it about intimacy that feels so terrifying to me? At first, the avoidant may try to avoid this self-reflection. They may tell themselves that they're better off without the connection, or they might convince themselves that they're not ready for a relationship. They may justify their actions by pushing the blame onto you, telling themselves you were too much or that you were being too persistent. But deep down, that self-deception starts to crack. When you stop texting, they can no longer use you as an emotional distraction. They can no longer avoid the discomfort of facing themselves. The most powerful part of this shift is that it forces the avoidant to evaluate their own behavior, not yours. The relationship patterns they've created aren't just about you. They're about their own inner fears and insecurities. And when those patterns are disrupted, they are forced to question the beliefs and assumptions they've been carrying. They may begin to recognize that they've been sabotaging their relationships, that they've been pushing people away to protect themselves from the very thing they desire most, intimacy and connection. This process of self-evaluation isn't easy for the avoidant. It's uncomfortable, messy, and often filled with resistance. They might not be ready to admit that they've been avoiding vulnerability or pushing people away out of fear. They might not even know how to process the emotions that arise when they realize they've been using distance as a shield. But the fact remains that the disruption you've created forces them to see their behavior from a different perspective. It forces them to confront the truth about their emotional walls, their defenses, and their self-sabotaging patterns. When this happens, there's a chance for real change. For the first time, the avoidant might be able to see how their fear of rejection, their fear of getting too close, has been keeping them from having the kind of relationships they truly want. And this self-awareness is the first step toward growth. When someone becomes aware of their own patterns, they can begin to break free from it. They can start to change their approach to relationships and intimacy. But none of this can happen unless they are forced to confront their own behavior. By stopping the flow of communication, you aren't just giving them space to miss you or wonder about you. You're giving them the space to grow. You're providing them with the opportunity to face themselves in a way they've been avoiding for a long time. And this is how true change happens, through discomfort, through reflection, and through the willingness to face the truth. So when you stop texting, when you step back and create that silence, you're not just disappearing from their life, you're creating the conditions for them to reevaluate everything that has held them back. You're offering them the chance to break free from their emotional patterns, to challenge their fears, and to become the person they need to be to create healthier, more meaningful relationships in the future. In conclusion, breaking a pattern with an avoidant can feel challenging, but it's ultimately a gift, both to yourself and to them. It's an opportunity for growth, self-reflection, and the chance to step into healthier, more balanced relationships. Remember, real change doesn't come from comfort. It comes from facing discomfort head on. So trust the process, honor your boundaries, and allow space for transformation. Thank you for taking the time to explore these insights today. I wish you strength, clarity, and the courage to embrace the journey ahead. Goodbye for now, and take care.